Good afternoon. So I'm very happy to be in Changsha and to share some interesting progress that we have made in pedestrian safety research. Since this morning, we have looked at few presentations specifically describing pedestrian safety issue. So I start with this as it was shown. I think it was one of the first presentations, probably your presentation, which showed the risk that is being faced by pedestrians in you showed BRICS country, but it is a problem in most other countries also. WHO report, the current 2018 report states 400,000 pedestrians die every year, with half of these deaths occurring in low and middle income countries. Around 138,000 pedestrians and cyclists lost their lives in EU roads between 2001 to 2013. So if you take an average, it's about 10,000 pedestrians per year in EU also, where otherwise they have made good progress in reducing safety. And pedestrians and cyclists together in EU form about 30% of total road traffic crashes. US also, this morning earlier Brian showed you this graph that how US has got much success since 1970 in reducing crashes. But pedestrian issue remains still a very problematic issue in US also. And US reported on an average of 6,000 pedestrian fatalities between 2016 and 17. And the proportion of pedestrian fatalities increased from 14% in 2008 to 19% in 2017. So pedestrian fatality remains a big still challenge for all the people who are working in this field. So this again, the important trend that we can summarize is that most motorized countries, high-income countries, have reported reduction in fatalities, whereas many less motorized countries continue to face still increasing trends. However, pedestrian safety has been a difficult issue in all countries, regardless of whether they are high income or low income. And then the progress since 2000, lot of efforts have been done to address pedestrian safety issue, and yet EU country report states that in the last 10 years, deaths among pedestrians decreased by 41%, however cyclists by 31% and power two-wheelers by 34% compared to 53% decrease for vehicle occupants, which is saying that all the efforts that we have done, we are more successful in reducing deaths of vehicle occupants, not so much for pedestrian safety. And in US also we find that although pedestrian deaths were 20% lower in 2017 as compared to 1975, but they increased 45% since reaching their lowest point in 2009. So after 2009 in US also it's started increasing. So this is a matter of much concern. So with these trends, now let us see. So actually I started looking at the history of pedestrian deaths, and I found that the first one was reported in 1899. And at that time the vehicles were really had not become commercial, they were not so much on the roads. But this particular one, which was reported in 1899, was in an exhibition ground where they were displaying the first, they called it horseless carriage, which was the first car. The vehicle was designed only to go at a maximum speed of 13 kilometers per hour. And for the exhibition, the driver was told not to exceed the speed limit more than 6 kilometers per hour. And when this vehicle started coming and there was this pedestrian standing, Bridget Driscoll, and the driver kept shouting, but the pedestrian was too confused. I mean, this is all I read in the archives. And finally, it hit the pedestrian, this lady, this lady fell down and her head hit the ground, and that ended up being a first fatal crash. When you read the description, I mean, this was something so unusual that, of course, it went to the court, but the court ordered a very detailed inquiry as to what happened. Let's try and understand. And all of that investigation was based on what the witnesses had seen. So there were several witnesses which reported what happened, and based on that, they tried to arrive at a decision. And witnesses' statement mostly were about that, and in fact the judge also asked how many weeks of training did the driver have, did they put up enough messages on the ground that there's going to be an exhibition vehicle, did the road users knew that this kind of exhibition is going to happen. And as I told you, that the vehicle was only designed to go at a maximum speed of 13 kilometers per hour. So what fascinated me after this, when I start looking at how this thing has been happening, that even today when you see many of the investigations continue to be dominated by the same framework. We keep on focusing on driver training, where the people were educated. So that part is quite fascinating. However, when I started looking at more details, I find two really seminal studies done in 1950s. And the two studies that I have listed here, which the details are given in my paper, Cohen and Delaney studied in detail pedestrian crossing behavior and what kinds of gaps were being accepted by pedestrians when they were crossing the road and how they were behaving facing the traffic. So this was one of the first empirical observational study reported in literature, and it kind of established how such studies have to be done scientifically. The second one, also very important study, which was done by William Haddon Jr. and Valian. This was also in late 50s. This study was about studying pedestrian behavior in New York. Adult pedestrians who were fatally injured by motor vehicles in New York, they were studied. And I think this was one of the first case control studies where they tried to match the people who had been involved in crashes and people who had not been involved in crashes, controlling for all other factors. So imagine this was done in 1950s. The study was based on, I think that this part is very important because this is again listed in that study report. The study was based on the premise that it was more important to understand the pedestrian characteristics, socioeconomic status of the pedestrian rather than the pedestrian actions. For example, disobeying given traffic regulation. Because if you recall what Brian had showed earlier, since 1930s onwards, there was a lot of stress on how people behave on the road, and we have to educate them to follow rules and do the right things. So this is one of the first studies which said, okay, let's, instead of focusing on that, let's try and understand what are the other characteristics of pedestrians which is common in people in getting involved in fatal crashes. So these two are really seminal studies which actually established how the scientific studies have to be done. Few other very important studies which are also available in the literature are again based on some very important questions. So Stina Sandels in Sweden published her study in 1968, and she was focusing on school children's behavior, young children behavior. And the question this study tried to ask was, what happens if children are too immature to be able to derive any benefits from the traffic instructions that is given to them? Why this question was asked? Because until then there was a big focus on educating kindergarten children to be safe on the road. And there were school programs teaching children how to be safe on the roads. and they were finding that it was not giving any major benefits. So Steiner Sandel and her whole group did this very important study and published their results. And the main conclusion of this study was that children below the age of approximately 10 years do not have sensory or cognitive ability to cope up with modern traffic. This is 1968, and now we are in 2019, and you find still in many countries programs focusing on how to educate children to be safe on the road. Another important study was again by Schieber and Thompson. For a young child, the act of crossing a street is a conscious problem-solving situation, with each circumstance appearing to be unique. So basically they were trying to show that there is no fixed pattern that you can tell people, children, do it like this when you face a situation like this. Because for them, every situation is a unique situation. So their question also was, is a child ready and able to acquire the necessary skills through education or training? Or should these approaches be made secondary to efforts designed to change driver behavior, adult supervision, or the roadway environment? So again, very, very important questions. And I think main thing that is coming out from these studies is that children and human beings have certain cognitive shortcomings. We can't change that. And that is why it's important to change other things. So then I have a whole, we all are working in this area. You all are working in this area. So you know what kind of studies we are doing these days. And when I trace the history of, after finding these really strong, important results from these research studies, more and more research is going on. We have developed more new methods of statistical analysis. We just saw in the previous presentation, Bayesian approach and hierarchical random parameter models. We have more techniques of actually collecting very sophisticated data. Now we are doing it through video cameras. We can monitor pedestrian behavior. We have video tracking images, image processing techniques. So we can, the first study which was done in 50s of gap acceptance was doing exactly what we are doing now with image processing cameras, image processing techniques. We are very precisely finding when people decide to cross the road, what is the gap between the oncoming vehicle and when you decide to cross the road, etc. We're still collecting the same kind of data, more detailed data. We have micro simulation techniques now to predict pedestrian behavior. We have multi-agent simulation systems based on artificial intelligence concepts. And also we have finding that researchers are suggesting to combine road crossing behavior with route choice behavior. So we have sophisticated route choice models, and we have more methods of developing route choice models also. Now currently we have also started using what the psychologists use as theory of planned behavior. So in route choice also we introduce theory of planned behavior. We have structural equation modeling, so we have a lot of interesting sophisticated models now. But what I find fascinating is we are still studying the same phenomena. Many of us continue to work on collecting more data on how people cross the road and what are these circumstances under which they start doing different things. And can we do something to change their behavior? So broad understanding of pedestrian behavior that was reported in 50s and 60s and 70s has more or less remained unchanged. So I think that tells us something about human beings across the world. So what have we learned from many other studies also that we see now, speed control seems to have a very strong influence on whether we are going to have fatal crash or severity of crash or crash at all. All three are related to that. But a new Swedish study, so earlier we had that very strong empirical graph where we always saw that if the impact speed is 30 kilometers or less, the probability of fatal crash reduces to less than 10%. And if the impact speed is about 50 kilometers per hour, the probability of fatal crash with pedestrian is more than 80%. The new Swedish study shows that fatal accidents, excluding run-over accidents, are rare at mean travel speeds below 40 kilometers per hour, while severe injury accidents are quite frequent at mean speeds below 35 kilometers per hour. But rare at mean travel speeds below 25 kilometers per hour. So this is an important finding, and we can think about it how we start using it now when we are designing our safe speed limits for cities. Another important finding is, again, from many different parts of the world, similar results have been reported. Additional walking distance to cross the road over the pedestrian bridge is less appealing than using a zebra crossing when available, even if it is less attractive when compared to crossing directly somewhere on the road. So what does it mean? For increasing pedestrian safety, we often try to make either zebra crossing, but at zebra crossing, vehicles have to stop or reduce their speed. So very often on highways or higher category roads, we end up doing a foot over bridge where pedestrians are expected to go up and down. And studies from different parts of the world report that this is what pedestrians don't like to do. The effectiveness of using foot over bridge is much less than just going at grade crossing. So this is like summary of at least 7-8 different studies from different parts of the world, which suggest that pedestrian bridges should only be considered in extreme cases, as they seem to be non-effective crossing facility, because pedestrians still like to be at grade. To solve conflicts between traffic and pedestrian flows, it is preferable to propose at level signalized crossings along with underpass and overpass for roads. So basically vehicles can go up and down, and as long as possible we have to keep pedestrians at grade. More learnings that we have now. I think from this, if we start summarizing, so what is a future challenge? Because I start with that, the numbers of pedestrian fatalities in all so-called high-income countries to low-income countries, more successful countries to less successful countries, pedestrian safety remains a challenge. So what's a future challenge? We need new research to make cities safer for pedestrians in all countries. Revisiting current speed limits, because at present we find that in cities the speed limit recommended is 50 kilometers per hour maximum speed on arterial roads, and most of the cities really meant for 30 kilometers per hour. But the new research coming from Sweden also is showing that perhaps we have to rethink this also. 30 also may be leading to many serious injury crashes. And the other factor we have to remember is that now we have more adult, older population in many of our countries. So for older people, we again have to rethink what is a safe speed limit. There is consensus on design principles which can lead to safer cities, which is saying that we can have higher mixed land use patterns that reduces our exposure because we are doing shorter travel. Many of these situations already exist in less motorized countries. Many Asian cities are like this. High density, mixed land use. So we have to do a lot of learnings from these situations, and why is it difficult to replicate this and create safe environments for pedestrians. And third, of course, is that we do find there are a lot of barriers in implementing some of these things, and we have to understand that. So the last few things we have to remember is that many Asian countries, India with 1.3 billion population, plus if you look at all of South Asia, similar conditions, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Thailand is not very different. So here we find that highways pass through towns and small villages. So now we are mixing high-speed roads designed for high-speed through traffic with lot of local traffic and presence of pedestrians. What standards and what methods we have to make this safer? So there are no known standards for this. So we need to do a lot of work in this area. And last thing is this. I didn't explain you that painting I showed you in the beginning. So after few pedestrian crashes were reported in the world, actually this famous painter from Spain became very famous for this painting. This was done in 1936, showing an accident. And I think the last thing is this only, that this still remains a big challenge. This was done in 1936, and we are talking about meeting SDG goals in 2030 now. 2020 we are not going to meet. So that's why I've said 100 years later, are we going to solve this problem? I think for this research community it remains a big challenge, and we have to focus on this. Thank you.